A raw March wind comes down off the ridge and crosses 2 acres of cracked, colorless earth, a field the whole county has already buried. Past it stands a weathered barn, and past the barn, an auction yard thick with cold mud and the reek of frightened animals. Inside that yard, a crowd of men in oiled coats laughs at something. A slight figure in a dead man's coat stands at the pen rail, chin level $31 folded flat against her hip. Her hand rises. The laughter sharpens. Somewhere near the gatepost, a prosperous man in canvas leans close to another and grins the grin of someone certain he is watching a fool ruin herself. She does not lower her arm. 34 half-starved creatures nobody wanted. A last dollar. A field where nothing has grown in 2 long years. And a plan no one in that yard has thought to look for. I want to help with this and I can, but let me flag 2 things, honestly, before I do because they affect what you'll actually get. First, the word count. The story you sent runs about 22,000 words as is. My proposed fixes are mostly surgical, correcting the orange timeline error, removing the spliced counting passage, trimming the multi-layered ending, and reducing a few near verbatim repeats. Those fixes subtract words rather than add them. To reach 23,000 to 25,000, I'd need to add 1,500 to 3,000 words of new material, which pulls in tension with the goal of removing padding and repetition to hit 10 out of 10. I can do both, tighten the flawed spots and add genuine new forward-moving material elsewhere, more of the Sabotage subplot, the widow, the young farmer, Silas's backstory, so the additions earn their place rather than pad. I just want you to know that's the approach. Second, I can't paste 24,000 words in a single readable message reliably, but I can produce the complete corrected story as one continuous file. No part breaks, no dividers, no explanations, and verify the exact word count with a script. So you know it lands in your 23,000 to 25,000 window. That's the clean way to guarantee the count and give you something easy to drop into your voice tool. Let me build it that way. Now apply all the fixes, add the earned material, verify the count, and present the full continuous text. The 3 parts total 21,100 words. To land at 23,000 to 25,000, while also fixing errors, which removes some words, I need to add roughly 2,500 to 4,000 words of genuine new scene material. Let me assemble the corrected continuous story, apply every fix, add earned material, and verify the count. Now let me apply the key fixes. First, the critical timeline error. Thorn seeing the orange before the fruit turns orange. Now the spliced counting passage that breaks the count at the end of part 2. Let me find and repair it. Now I'll restructure this so the counting flows cleanly, merge the 2 counting beats into one smooth sequence, and fix the orange running to the barn repeat and the inna autumn grammar error. Now fix the went to find her father's old market wagon in the back of the barn, which now conflicts with the later part 2 passage where she already dragged it out. Let me check for that duplication. Good line 184 part 2's later make ready scene already dragged out and repaired the wagon. My rewritten counting passage now ends with the neutral went to ready what she would need, so there's no conflict with found her father's old market wagon. The order is overnight orange reveal to counting to make ready scene drags out wagon. That flows. Now let me fix the near verbatim repeats. First, the pay forward never back duplication. I see line 246 has both the walk through death / left life repeat and the pay only forward repeat, and still contains the old in the work now. Creak of the traces, which I'd earlier softened in part 3, but the merge picked up an older version. Let me rewrite line 246 opening to remove both repeats and fix the plow tense. Now let me trim the multi-layered ending slightly and fix the debt is the kind you can only pay forward never back. At line 148, keep this one. Since it's the first occurrence, it's now unique. Let me check the final closing for the layered ending issue and check current word count. 21,130 words. I need to add 2,000 to 3,900 words of genuine new scene material to reach 23,000 to 25,000 while keeping quality high. I'll add earned new scenes that deepen the story without padding one, an expanded early scene of Adeline's isolation and a memory of her mother. 2. A mid-story scene deepening the young farmer subplot / a second visitor. 3. An expanded confrontation beat with Hartzell midsummer, and 4. A winter-forward coda scene, showing Thorne learning the method. Let me insert these at natural points. First, an early story deepening Adeline's solitude and her mother placed after the fence-mending crisis. Now a midsummer scene deepening the Hartzell conflict, a public encounter in Dunmore that raises stakes. Let me place it after the bank reservation discovery. Now a winter-forward coda scene, Thorne coming to learn the method, fulfilling the promise, and showing the county's transformation, placed before the final field walk. Let me find a good insertion point near the end. 22,472, need 530 plus more to safely clear 23,000. Let me add one more earned scene, an expanded Harvest Week beat with a human moment and a small deepening of the young farmer's second appearance. Let me add a beat during the picking about the physical realities and a neighbor who quietly helps. 22,751, need 250 plus more to clear 23,000 comfortably. Let me add one final earned beat, a short deepening of the auction day moment in part 1, her interior state as she raises her hand, which strengthens the opening. Let me find that spot. Very close, 22,903. Let me add one more short beat to clear 23,000, cleanly deepening the widow scene's aftermath. 23,000, 14 words inside your 23,000 to 25,000 window. Now let me do a final verification pass. Check the orange timeline is fixed everywhere. Confirm no remaining, the orange running to the barn. Before the reveal, and scan for the double-ending issue. All orange mentions now occur at or after the overnight reveal line 196. The timeline error is fixed. Thorne's earlier visit now correctly references green vines and swelling fruit. The story is corrected, expanded with earned material, and lands at 23,014 words. Here is the complete corrected story. The laughter reached her before her arm was fully raised. It moved through the auction yard the way a raw wind moves off a ridge in the last week of March, sliding under collars, finding the back of the neck. First, a few dry chuckles from the men near the loading chute, then a short snort from someone by the fence rails, then the loose, careless laugh of the big landholder in the oiled canvas coat who had propped himself against the gate post since before the gates opened, standing there as though the whole of Wexford County had been deeded to him at birth, and he was only waiting for the rest of them to acknowledge it. He made no effort to hide the sound. It spilled out of him, plainly mixing with the smell of cold hay churned mud and animals that had been hauled too far too early in the season. Adeline Merrick kept her hand in the air. She was small the way people grow small when they have worked since they could walk and never once eaten to the full measure of their hunger. Narrow across the shoulders, browned already by a sun that had barely warmed the year, with a stillness in her face that strangers took for slowness, and that a sharper eye would have read as something harder and more deliberate than any of them guessed. Her palms were split with old calluses. Her boots had been resoled twice by her own hand. The coat across her shoulders had belonged to her father Silas, dead now 2 winters, and it still carried the shape of a larger man in its seams. She stood at the rail of the piglet pen, with her chin held level and her arms steady, and if a deeper color had come into her cheeks under all that laughter, her eyes gave nothing away. The auctioneer regarded her the way men at livestock sales regard a young woman who lifts her hand for the one lot the whole yard has already agreed to leave alone. Not cruel in it, only startled as though a fence post had spoken. He called the bid without flourish. 34 piglets, $31. The full sum she had carried into that yard, folded flat and warm from the pocket of Silas Merrick's coat. The man in the canvas coat leaned toward the fellow beside him and murmured something, and that fellow laughed too, and the pair of laughs rode across the trampled ground after her, as she went to the pen where the animals stood jammed into the far corner. Thin through the ribs, dull in the eye, trembling in a way that had nothing left to do with the cold. She had driven to Dunmore before there was any light in the sky. The road from her farm into the market town ran long and deeply cut this time of year, the ruts frozen at dawn and softening to grease by mid-morning, and the old wagon Silas had left her demanded a slow hand on every grade, or it would sluice sideways into the ditch. She had sat in that yard in the dark, with the reins slack across her knees, waiting for the gates to be thrown open, $31, pressed flat against her hip, listening to the horses stamp and blow in the cold. She had not been afraid. That was the detail she would keep from that morning long after the rest of it blurred. Not the laughter, not the ache in her fingers, but the plain absence of fear where fear should have sat. A settled certainty had taken its place weeks before on the evening she first crouched at the margin of the dead pumpkin field and laid her bare palm against the pale, fractured ground, and understood a thing about it that no one else in the county had thought to kneel down and look for. The field lay between her barn and the county road, 2 acres of used-up earth, cracked pale as weathered bones still snarled with the brittle vines of a crop that had failed the season before and the season before that one. Every soul in Wexford County who had an opinion held the same one: the ground was finished. She had come to believe otherwise. The weeks leading to the auction had been quiet ones, the particular quiet that arrives when a person has run clean out of the choices everyone approves of, and begins at last to examine the ones they have all walked past. Each evening of that long fortnight, she had walked the dead rows, always at the same hour, when the light came in low from the west and raked across the ground, sidelong, showing what the flat glare of noon kept hidden. The surface split away in long, irregular seams, like a thing that had dried and shrunk from somewhere deep inside itself. She had gone down on one knee at the near edge that first evening and lifted a fistful, letting it spill through her fingers. It did not crumble. It broke in stiff little plates that dropped like fragments of a shattered crock, packed and shut against the air. The earth here had forgotten the trick of breathing. The dead vines still lay where two failures had left them, matted together in a low tangle over the whole of the 2 acres. Any farmer with a working plow would have turned them under before the first frost, but she had no plow that would hold a share and no coin to hire a team that did, and so the vines had stayed through the winter, graying under the snow. Most of the men in Dunmore who had bothered to look at the field at all counted those vines as one more proof the land was dead. Rot on a carcass, one of them had called it cheerfully, as if the phrase were a favor he was doing her. She had never once agreed. She walked the ruined rows, slowly crouching every few paces, spreading her palm flat, then working her stiff fingers an inch or two down through the split crust. On the third evening, she found the thing she had half known would be there. Beneath the dry upper skin and the gray soil that had never fully surrendered its damp, she felt them under her fingertips. Small hard shapes no larger than a thumbnail, unmoved, uncounted, forgotten entirely by the two barren seasons that had passed indifferently overhead. Old pumpkin seeds still lodged in the dark, still whole in their coats. She sat back on her heels and studied the field a long while as the light went. The seeds had never sprouted. That much was plain. 2 seasons they had lain in the black, and for 2 seasons the ground above them had been too locked and too starved to offer them anything worth rising toward. It was not the seeds that had given out. It was the earth beneath them that had nothing left to hand up. She rolled one seed slowly between thumb and forefinger, its hull dry to the touch, but sound, and understood then, whole and clear, what she had only grasped in part when she first knelt at the field's edge. The land did not want new seed. It did not want to be replanted or turned again or signed over to some man with a heavier team. It wanted life put back down into it. Not the labor of hands grinding against dead soil, but something moving through the ground itself, splitting it open from within, warming it, working it, feeding it up from below. She set the seed back into its seam with the care of someone returning, a thing that did not belong to her, stood and turned toward the barn with the shape of a plan already hardening in her chest. She walked into Dunmore the next morning with the figures set out in her head like coins on a counter. 2 acres, hard-pan clay, stripped past the point where any root could take a purchase. She had turned the whole of it over through the previous evening, seated on the porch step while the last light drained off the far fences, and she had come to town not to be talked out of anything, but to confirm the single number she still lacked the price of doing the thing the way any reasonable person would do it. Gideon Thorne, who kept the feed store, was a broad and unhurried man who had sold seed and lime and iron to every farm family in the county for the better part of 30 years. He knew land the way an old country doctor knows a cough by its category, by the pattern of what had failed in his hearing before. He listened to her lay out the field with his forearms folded on the counter, his face neither warm nor discouraging, only weighing. 2 acres of hardpan, she told him. 2 seasons without a crop. Soil pressed flat and picked clean of whatever it had once held. He nodded slow. What are you aiming to do with it then? Bring it back, she answered, and there was no pleading in it, only fact. He quoted her the cost of a proper breaking the hire of a team heavy enough to bite that clay the wear on the share the long hours of it. Then he quoted the amendments the ground would want before it would carry a crop again. Lime, he said, worked in deep, well-rotted matter down to a real depth, not a scratch on the surface. Likely a second pass the following year just to see where the field stood after the first. For a farm with something behind it, the sum was steep, but not impossible. For her standing there in a patch coat with $31 to her name, it might as well have been called out in the tongue of some far country she would never see. She let nothing of that cross her face. He watched her a moment, then shook his head, not unkindly the way a man shakes his head at weather he has no power to turn. That ground's been worked past the easy cures, he told her, and his voice carried the weight of a man who took no pleasure in the saying. There comes a point where what it costs to bring a field back runs past anything it'll ever hand you. Might be kinder to let it lie. Might be wiser to sell the parcel off if you can find a soul willing to take it. She thanked him, and she meant the thanks. He had given her the truth as he understood it plainly and at no charge, and she held no grievance against him for the shape of it. She drew the borrowed heat of her father's coat a little closer and stepped back out into the thin March air. On the road home, the numbers she carried had changed their nature entirely. No longer the hire of a team she could never afford, nor the weight of lime scattered over ground, too poor to hold it. She was turning over instead the notice she had seen tacked to the post outside the mill, the livestock sale set for the coming Saturday at the Dunmore Fairgrounds. She was turning over what a living, breathing thing might do to soil that iron could only mimic and never truly wake. She was turning over $31 and what $31 might honestly buy, and whether against every scrap of good advice in the county, it might be precisely enough. The walk back felt shorter than any walk she had taken that spring. Something had closed over the doubt quiet as a door easing shut. That evening she stood at the field's edge until the light was fully gone, and she did not kneel and she did not test the ground because she had already made her peace with what it was and what it lacked. She only looked, letting her eyes travel the pale ruin of it from the barn wall to the road, and the plan sat in her like a stone dropped into a still pond, heavy and settled, sending nothing to the surface. A woman with nothing left to lose, she had come to understand, is not poorer than her neighbors. She is freer than all of them. The fairgrounds on the edge of Dunmore smelled the way they always smelled, when the year first turned toward planting old hay gone musty over winter axle grease, and the sharp animal reek of stock that had been driven or hauled some distance to be sold. She reached the pens before the first lots went through, and she took the long way around the outside rail so she might study the animals without being caught at the studying. The air still held enough bite to show her breath. The men bunched near the main gate cradled tin cups in both hands and traded talk in the loose, unpressed way of people with nowhere they urgently needed to be. She found herself a place at the back rail of the small holding pen and waited. The morning moved through its familiar order. Good breeding stock went early and went dear. A matched pair of aging workhorses set two brothers from the east side of the county arguing across the ring in low, stubborn voices. Somewhere in the muddle, a lot of laying hens fetched more than any honest man would have guessed they were worth, which pleased the seller considerably, and no one else at all. Then the piglets came through the gate. There were 34 of them, and they moved in a loose, frightened knot so small that the pen seemed built for larger and prouder animals. Their ribs showed plain from across the yard. Their ears sat too big for their narrow skulls, the way the very young go when they have not yet grown to fit themselves, and their legs carried them with the uncertain, apologetic step of creatures that had been handed less than they needed for far too long. The auctioneer read out the lot number with the same easy neutrality he brought to every line of his book. But the pause he left before the opening call held something the rest did not: a practiced gentleness, the delicacy of a man stepping wide around a subject to which he already knows the miserable answer. The crowd did not lean toward the pen. It leaned away from it, or bent its collective gaze down toward its own boots, or folded into small private conversations with whoever stood nearest. One man near the front set his coffee on a rail, took a single look, and picked the cup straight back up. Not a hand rose. Then from somewhere in the loose middle of the yard came a laugh she already knew. It belonged to the man who farmed the 200 acres east of the county road, Colonel Hartzell, a prosperous and heavy-handed operation. Deep black soil, a barn painted every third summer, teams that were never worked past their prime. He was not laughing at the animals exactly. He was laughing at the plain absurdity of the whole arrangement, which is a colder thing and somehow a meaner one. A girl with $30 of runt hog and 2 acres of dead dirt he offered to the man at his elbow, pitching it to carry across the yard, has gone and invented herself a brand new road to the poorhouse. Low agreement rippled out from him, not vicious, only the comfortable nodding of people who found the observation fair and the entertainment free. Her hand went up before the last of that laugh had finished crossing the ground. She had not planned the timing of it, had meant to wait for the auctioneer's call, but something in the colonel's easy amusement had reached into her and lifted her arm before her caution could stop it, and she was glad of it after, because a hand raised into laughter is a different thing from a hand raised into silence. It said she had heard them and chosen anyway. It said the laughter had not been a reason, but a wind she had leaned into. She felt every eye in the yard swing toward her and settle, felt the particular weight of a whole crowd deciding in the same instant that they were watching a fool. And she held her arms steady through all of it, because she had made her peace with their verdict weeks ago at the edge of a dead field and had no intention of renegotiating it now. The auctioneer looked at her for a beat with something near apology working at the corner of his mouth. He called it once. He called it twice. When no one in that whole company stirred a finger against her, he brought the gavel down and took her $31, writing out the receipt in careful pencil against the flat of the ledger, as though the sum, however small, deserved a clean hand. The colonel watched the transaction with the indulgent half-smile of a man storing up a story to tell at supper. The receipt went into the coat pocket where the money had been, and she stood a moment, holding the ledger's careful pencil sum, all that remained now of the year's small hoard, and felt the yard's amusement settle over her shoulders like a second colder coat. She did not shrug it off. She had learned that a thing shrugged off too quickly only came back heavier. She let it sit, and she looked at the animal she had bought, and she let the two of them, herself and her ruin, get properly acquainted before she did anything at all. She backed the wagon to the loading chute herself, refusing the sniggering help of two boys who offered it only to watch her fail, and she moved the 34 animals up the boards with a patience that outlasted their fright. One bolted the ramp and had to be gathered from under the wheels. She did it without temper, without haste, murmuring low, nothing words the way Silas had murmured them to spooked stock her whole childhood, and one by one, the small bodies gave over their panic and let themselves be loaded. When the tailboard was pinned, she climbed to the bench, took up the reins, and turned the team toward home, without once looking back at the men still watching to see whether she would. She drove out of Dunmore with 34 piglets shifting in the wagon bed, and 31 fewer dollars to stand between her and ruin, and the laughter from the yard rode along the whole length of the county road, with her lodging somewhere below the ribs, where she could not quite work it loose. The animals rode quiet for most of the miles. They lay against one another the way small starved things lie when they have finally given up any expectation of good and settled instead on the plainer work of enduring. She understood the posture from the inside. She let them keep it and asked nothing of them and drove. Twice on that long ride home, the wagon slewed on a soft grade, and she came down off the bench to set her shoulder against the wheel boots, sliding in the thaw while the animals lurched and squealed behind her. Both times she got it clear alone, because there was no one on that road who would have stopped to lend a hand to the girl the whole county was already laughing at, and both times she climbed back to the bench with her breath ragged and her resolve unbudged. A body learns fast which help is coming and which is only a rumor, she thought, taking up the slick reins again. Hers had never come. She had stopped some years back waiting for it. She thought of her father as the miles unwound because the coat across her shoulders would not let her think of anything else for long. Silas Merrick had bought this same failing ground for a song from a man leaving for the Western Territories, and he had believed in it the way other men believed in Scripture plainly, without needing it proved. He had died in the second bad winter with the field already turning against him, and his last clear words to her had not been of love or of God but of soil, a low murmur she had bent close to catch. The ground keeps its own counsel, he had told her, his hand gone light as paper in hers. You just have to be the one who's still there when it decides to talk. She had been 15. She was the one still there. The dead field waited for her as it always waited, pale and patient. The old vine strung dry and knotted across its face like something the ground itself had abandoned and left out to bleach in the weather. 2 acres of split clay between the barn and the road laid over now with the long shadows of a failing afternoon. She put the animals in the barn that first night, drew them water, doled out a little feed she could not honestly spare, and stood at the fence line until the last of the light drained away. looking at the ground the way another woman might look at a debt she had chosen, eyes open to take on. 3 days she gave to the fence. The wire had been rolled and stacked behind the barn for years, rusted through in patches, kinked and stiff. The kind of salvage that opened the skin of your hands if you handled it careless, and often enough when you handled it careful. She wore her father's stiff work gloves, the leather molded to fingers broader than her own, so that every grip was a small argument between her hand and his. She labored in the cold, early hours before the day's thin warmth built, and again in the long slant of evening when it eased, and through the flat middle of the day, she rested in the barn's shade, soaked her split palms in a basin, and went back to it. She hauled wire taut against posts that had stood since her father's time, drove fresh stakes where the old ones had gone soft with rot, and packed the low washes where a determined piglet might root a path to freedom. She rehung the sagging gate until it swung level and dropped its latch clean on the first try. It was not fine work. It would have drawn no ribbon at any fair in the state. But it was honest, and it was tight, and it would hold what she meant it to hold, which was the only measure of a fence that had ever counted for anything. On the second night before the fence was anywhere near sound, the wind came up hard out of the northwest and worried a loose board on the barn's low side until it gave. And by the time she woke to the racket and crossed the frozen yard in her father's coat thrown over her nightclothes, 3 of the animals had shouldered through the gap and gone rooting off into the dark. She found 2 of them within the hour by the sound of them snouts already buried in the very ground the whole county had written off, as if the dead field called to them louder than the open dark. The third she did not find until near dawn, wedged shivering in the dry wash below the road, too spent to climb out, and she went down into the cold mud on her knees and hands and hauled the animal up against her chest and carried it back the whole distance, its heart slamming against her breastbone like a fist against a door. She did not lose one. She had decided, somewhere in that muddy wash, with her arms full of another creature's terror, that she was not going to be a woman who lost things she had chosen to keep. She nailed the loose board fast before she slept, and she did not sleep long. Whatever it cost to hold a thing she thought tamping the last stake home in the gray of that morning is always less than the hollow place it leaves when you let it slip. She had learned that the expensive way in a house gone quiet by degrees, and she did not mean to learn it twice. The house had not always been so quiet. She let herself remember it that morning, standing in the cold with her hands wrapped and her breath smoking, because the fright of nearly losing an animal in the dark had loosened something in her that usually stayed shut. There had been a mother once, a slight woman with the same narrow shoulders Adeline had grown into, who had sung low over the stove in the winters when the wind came down off the ridge and rattled every loose pane in the place. She had died when Adeline was 9 of a fever that took her over the course of a single hard week and left the house with a silence in it that never entirely lifted afterward. Silas had not remarried, had not spoken of it, had only grown quieter himself and turned harder toward the ground, as though the soil were the one thing left that would answer a man who tended it faithfully. Adeline had learned her solitude from him the way a child learns a language without noticing she was learning it, until one day she found she could go a full week speaking to no living soul but the animals, and feel no particular lack in it. She understood wrapping her split hands by the gray light that the county mistook that solitude for something it was not. They thought a girl alone was a girl waiting to be rescued or ruined or married off to the first man with sense enough to take pity on her acreage. They could not conceive of a woman who had simply made her peace with standing by herself, who had built a life so narrow and so wholly her own that there was no room in it for the help they imagined she must be pining after. A person alone is only pitiable, she thought, to those who have never learned to keep their own company. She had learned it early. She had learned it at a graveside and again at a second one, and by the time the county got around to laughing at her, she had long since stopped needing any of them to think well of her at all. It was the freest thing about her, that not needing, and it was the one thing none of them could see. On the 4th morning she stood at that gate with the cold latch resting in her palm and looked back toward the barn where the animals had begun to stir and shove against the boards, hungry as they were every hour of every day. She drew one breath slow and even, the way Silas had taught her to draw it before any act that carried weight, and she lifted the latch. They came out of the dim barn in a single glad rush, small and quick, in a way they had shown nothing of in the auction pen, as though some buried spring in them had already begun to right itself the moment the door swung wide. They scattered across the field in every direction at once, snouts dropping to the pale ground before their feet had settled, driving into the cracked crust with a fixed instinctive urgency that pulled something close to a laugh up out of her before she knew it was coming. The soil went dark wherever they worked it, pale to black, shut to open, hard to soft, and spreading ragged patches across the vine-choked surface, as if the ground were being unstitched from below by 34 blunt and tireless needles. She crouched at the fence and watched it happen, and the feeling that rose in her was not faith, exactly nothing so trembling as faith. It was closer to recognition, to the settled ease of remembering a thing she had somehow always carried. My father used to say, "The land never dies," she thought, watching them tear the crust to ribbons. "It only lies down and waits to be asked the right way." Word had a way of moving through Wexford County without any single soul meaning to carry it. By the close of the first week, people knew. By the end of the second, they had already fitted the knowing with opinions. It began, she supposed, with Gideon Thorne's boy sent out on his father's errand, with the cart, who had slowed at the road long enough to take in the sight of 34 hogs, strung across the county's most famous deadfield snouts down, and working the pale dirt, and had carried the picture back to town like a coin he could not wait to spend. From there it traveled the way everything traveled, from the feed store to the mill, from the mill to the sale yard. From the sale yard out to every back porch and leaning fence post for miles in each direction. She felt it approaching before she ever saw it, the way a body feels weather building at the edge of a still afternoon. The first of the neighbors came on a Saturday, two of them drawing their wagon up short at the county road and standing at her low fence with their arms crossed and their hat brims tipped back, the posture of men who have arrived to look at a thing they have already decided about. They said almost nothing to her. They said it instead to each other, pitched just loud enough to reach her over the fence. "Dead field," one of them offered. "No feed in it," said the other, and the short, flat laugh that followed was answer enough. She went on mending the far corner without turning around and let the wire speak for her. More came in the days that followed. Most were not cruel precisely. They were only the way people are when they have gathered to witness what they take for a plain mistake, a little sorry for you, a little amused, entirely satisfied that they stand on the right side of the thing. She learned to work with her back to the road and her mind on the ground, to let their murmured verdicts pass through her like wind through a broken sash. The animals, for their part, cared nothing for any of it. They only rooted and grew slowly less gaunt and turned the field a little darker with each passing day. Colonel Hartzell came only once in those first weeks, and he did not trouble himself to leave his saddle. He drew his good bay up at the road on his way back from town, sat at easy with one gloved hand resting on the horn, and looked over her fence at the animals working her ground with the particular smile of a man who has money enough that another person's ruin can be a pleasant diversion rather than a warning. "You'll have killed the lot of them by June," he offered in the friendly tone that made it worse. "Then you'll have neither hog nor harvest, nor the sense you were born with, and I'll buy this parcel off the bank for what it's truly worth, which is next to nothing, and run my heifers on it." He tipped his hat as though he had paid her a courtesy. She straightened from the post she was setting and met his eye across the wire, and she did not raise her voice because the truest things rarely need it. "This ground buried a better man than you and me both," she told him, meaning her father and letting him think she meant the field, "and it hasn't finished having its say." The smile went out of his face a degree. He gathered his reins and rode on, and she watched the good bay carry him down the road toward all that black and easy soil he had never once had to fight for. And she felt, standing in the ruin, he coveted something she could not have named as anything but rich. Gideon Thorne himself came out on a Tuesday, which surprised her more than any laughter had. He was a broad and decent man who had carried her on credit more than once when a season went thin, and who meant no injury by anything he ever said. He stood at the fence a good while watching the hogs drive their snouts through the vine tangle, and then he walked up the lane to where she was setting a stake and told her carefully, in the manner of a man genuinely trying to spare another person, grief that pigs wanted proper pasture under them, or they would drop condition fast, that this ground held nothing to offer any living stomach, that she would be wise to move them off before she lost the whole of what little she had sunk into them. She thanked him, and she meant that too. He was not wrong about most pigs on most ground, and she granted him as much without argument. He lingered a breath past his, saying, waiting, she judged, for some flicker that told him she might yet see sense. When none came, he pressed his lips together and gave the single nod that decent men give when they have spoken their piece and can do no more with it, and he went back down the lane to his cart. She watched him go the length of the road before she turned again to the field, where the animals moved through the brittle vine mat with the same steady, absorbed purpose they had shown from the first hour. And the soil behind them lay open and turned, and for the first time in 3 long years, beginning to draw breath. She knelt and pressed her palm to a freshly rooted patch and felt it give beneath her weight, warm and yielding, where a month before it had been shut as a fist. They can keep their pity, she thought, rising with black earth ground into the lines of her hand. Pity costs them nothing, and it has never grown so much as a blade of grass. She had to go into Dunmore once more that month for a sack of the cheapest feed she could bargain Thorne into fronting her, because the field alone would not carry 34 growing animals through the lean weeks before it woke fully, and she had done the arithmetic of their hunger against her tin, and known she could not let them fall back into the gauntness she had bought them out of. The talk found her the moment she stepped down at the mill. It came sideways the way such talk always came, not to her face, but near enough to reach it from a knot of men waiting on their own grinding. "There goes the pig farmer," one of them offered, and the word farmer was bent just enough to make it the joke it was meant to be. Another wondered aloud to the general amusement whether she meant to plow with them next, or preach to them, or marry one. She crossed the yard through the middle of it, with the empty sack folded over her arm and her chin at the level she had held in the auction pen. And she did not hurry, because to hurry would have been to grant them the satisfaction of having moved her, and that was the one coin she had left that she refused on principle to spend. Thorne fronted her the feed, though he shook his head over the ledger while he did it. He was the only man in that town who had put a single dollar of faith behind her, even a grudging dollar, even while he counted her a fool, and she did not forget it. "A man can think you wrong to the marrow," she reflected on the ride home with the sack braced between her boots, "and still choose to be the one who doesn't let you starve for it." That was rarer than kindness. It was closer to grace. She let the thought keep her company the whole rutted distance, and it warmed her better than the thin sun did. The weeks that came after held a quiet of their own. Not the quiet of nothing stirring, but the deeper quiet of a thing laboring slowly out of sight. In the patient way, the best things tend to labor on any farm worth the name. She moved through her days. She hauled water from the well when the first hard warmth came down dry across the county road, splitting her hours between the animals and the 100 other tasks a farm demands of a single pair of hands. The hogs grew not swiftly, not in any way a passing eye would mark from one week to the next, but steadily in the manner of underfed things that have finally been shown the one door they needed. Their ribs sank back beneath flesh. Their coats lost the staring roughness of the sail pen. They moved across the ground now with a confidence that had been nowhere in them. The morning she loaded them, heads low, snouts busy, wholly given over to the serious labor of being what they were. The field changed around them by degrees so fine that a person coming only once a week might have missed the whole progression, but she was there at first light and again at dusk, and she marked each small turning as it arrived. The pale split surface was mostly gone now, churned under in long overlapping sweeps where the animals had worked and reworked the ground. What lay exposed in its place was a different color, entirely darker, heavier, near to the shade of creek-bottom mud after a hard rain, though no real rain had fallen to account for it. The dry vine tangle that had shrouded the acres since the last failed crop lay broken and pressed down into the earth, folded under, beginning to soften and rot, and hand back at last whatever it had drawn out. What everyone called a graveyard, she thought one evening. Watching the low sun catch the turned ground has only been a bed the whole time, made up in waiting. She fell into a rhythm with the animals that neither of them had been taught, and both of them seemed to know. Each morning she moved them by degrees across the field, penning them close with hurdles cut from the salvage wire, so their rooting fell where the ground most needed breaking. And each evening she studied what they had opened, kneeling at the fresh edges to read the soil, the way Silas had taught her to read it by color, and give and smell by the small pale life that had begun to thread through what had been dead clay. She could feel the field changing under her hand faster than she had dared hope, and she said so to no one, because the county was watching for her failure, with a patience that unsettled her more than any of its laughter, and she would not hand it the smallest early word to chew on. Let them wait, she thought, working the black grains between her fingers at dusk. The ground and I are in no hurry to satisfy them. She had begun in the last of those weeks to save every coin the farm did not strictly consume, dropping them one at a time into a tin she kept on the high shelf above the stove, because there was a second field she had been looking at for years, the way a body looks at a thing that already belongs to it in some manner not yet written down. The parcel bordered her own ground on the south 5 acres held by a bank 2 counties over that had taken it from a family broken by the same run of bad seasons that had nearly broken her. She did not let herself count the coins often. She only added to them and let the weight of the tin stand for a future she had not yet earned the right to name aloud. It was on a gray Tuesday morning in the low sidelong light just after the sun cleared the tree line that she first saw the shoots. They stood no more than an inch above the turned soil pale green, the tips still curled in on themselves the way new growth comes before it has quite made up its mind to be brave about the world. They had risen in loose clusters of 3 and 4 together, scattered across the darkened ground, in no pattern she could name, which was exactly as it should have been because no hand had set them there. She had planted nothing. No one had. They had lain in the exhausted ground since the crop that failed the year before last, waiting in the only fashion a seed knows how to wait completely without complaint, without the smallest guarantee that the waiting would ever end. She crouched over the nearest cluster a long time without laying a finger to it, reading the shape of the leaf. She had grown up at her father's heel in this same field, and she knew a pumpkin seedling at that stage, as surely as she knew her own name, knew the particular way it held its first pair of leaves cupped faintly upward, as though carrying something it did not wish to spill. She had half looked for this. She had turned the possibility over through the whole of the spring and into the first heat of summer, quietly never once speaking it, where another ear might catch it, half afraid that to say the thing aloud would be to make it fragile enough to break. She rose and let her gaze travel the field, and there were more clusters than she had first counted, a dozen at least, from where she stood, and the ground ran on toward the barn, holding who knew how many more. She marked the days after that against the growth the way a mother marks a child against a doorframe, in small pencil lines only she could read. The shoots that had stood curled and uncertain on the Tuesday were open by the Friday, their first true leaves flattening to the light, and by the following week a thin green tracery had begun to follow the old vine rows across the turned ground, as though the field were recalling, line by line, a shape it had known before and been forced to forget. She counted 11 clusters, then 19, then stopped counting a second time and let the ground keep its own tally because the arithmetic had passed beyond anything her fear could usefully weigh. The animals moved among the new growth without the least notion of what rose between their feet, snouts still down, still turning and warming and feeding the very ground that had begun quietly to reward them. She caught herself one evening at the fence wanting badly to tell someone. Not the county, never the county, but someone, anyone who would have understood the size of the thing without needing it, explained. There was no one. Silas was 2 winters in the ground, her mother longer than that, and the town had made its verdict plain enough that she would sooner have walked into a river than into the mill, with news it could turn against her. So she told the field instead, lo, the way her father had told it things. "You waited longer than I did," she said to the green trembling at her boots. "You've earned the right to be sure." And the field, having no answer a person could hear, gave the only answer it had, which was to go on rising. She did not go into Dunmore that day. She did not so much as mention it to the neighbor who passed on the road. She kept it the way a careful person keeps a small flame in a rising wind, cupped close, sheltered on every side, given to no one. The ground remembered what it was she thought, kneeling again in the wet light, with the first green trembling at her knee. It only needed something to walk through the dark and remind it. And down the county road, unknowing the men who had laughed, went on about their mornings, certain still that they had watched a girl throw her last dollar into a grave, while behind her fence, the grave quietly and without any witness, but her had begun to come back to life. The heat arrived in the last week of June the way a debt comes due all at once, and without apology pressing down on Wexford County until the air over the fields shimmered by mid-morning, and the dust on the road hung where a wagon had passed long after the wagon was gone. Adeline met it the way she met everything now, by rising earlier, and she was at the fence before the sun had cleared the tree line each morning to see what the night had added to the field while she slept. The shoots had stopped being shoots. They had become plants, coarse-leaved and serious, their vines beginning to reach across the dark ground with the blind confidence of things that have finally been given permission to want. She noticed the change in her own body before she named the change in the field. Her shoulders had filled out some against her father's coat, which she had folded away now that the mornings held their warmth, and her hands, though still split at the knuckle, had stopped bleeding when she gripped the wire. The work had made her over into something harder through the winter of doubt, and now the summer was remaking her again into someone who woke without dread. She had not felt the absence of dread in so long that its return unsettled her, the way a familiar road unsettles a person who has walked it only in the dark. The animals had grown past any resemblance to the frightened knot she had loaded at the fairgrounds. They ran heavy through the shoulders now, their coats bristled and bright, and they moved across the rows with a proprietary ease, as if the field had always belonged to them, and the pale ruin of spring had been someone else's bad dream. She had begun to worry in a way she had not expected to worry about their very success. A hog that has grown strong and certain of its ground is a hog that will root where it pleases, and where it pleased them now was too often the base of a thriving vine, where their blunt work threatened to undo in an afternoon what a month of patience had built. She solved it the way she solved most things, by watching until the ground told her what it wanted. She cut fresh hurdles from the last of the salvaged wire, and she began to move the animals in a tightening spiral, penning them each day onto the ground that most needed opening, while walling them off from the rows that had already taken. It cost her an hour at each end of the day, shifting the panels, coaxing 34 stubborn bodies from a place they had decided was theirs to a place they had not yet learned to love. They fought her on it every morning for a week. Then, the way animals do, they stopped fighting and simply went where the gap in the wire allowed, and the field breathed easier for the arrangement. The first man to come to her fence with a question instead of a verdict arrived on a scorching afternoon in the middle of July, and the strangeness of it took her a moment to absorb. He was a young farmer from the far side of the county, newly married and newly broke, with a stretch of thin ground he had bought too dear and could not make pay, and he had heard the talk and driven the long way around to see the field for himself. He did not lean on her fence with folded arms. He stood at it with his hat in his hands, which no man had done at that fence all year, and he asked her plainly how she had done it. She looked at him a while before she answered, weighing whether the question was a trap the county had sent ahead of itself. It was not. It was only a frightened man grasping at the one green thing in a dry season, and she recognized the grasp because she had lived inside it herself not 6 months before. So she told him. She told him about the pigs and the rooting and the slow, patient work of letting a living thing do what iron could only imitate, and she watched the hope and the doubt fight it out across his young face. It won't work fast, she warned him, before the hope could run away with him. It took mine 2 full seasons of waiting before I understood what the ground was asking for, and one more of trusting it. There's no quick way through. He nodded slowly, turning his hat in his hands, and she saw that the slowness was the part he had not wanted to hear and the part he most needed to. He thanked her with an earnestness that embarrassed them both and drove off, and she stood at the fence and understood that the county's story about her had cracked quietly along a new line. She was no longer only the girl who had thrown her dollar into a grave. She had become, to at least one desperate man, the one person for miles who knew a thing worth asking after. She did not let it swell her. She had watched the county's regard swing too fast in her direction to trust it the same way she would not have trusted a warm morning in February. But the young farmer's hat in his hands stayed with her longer than any of the laughter had, because it was the first evidence she had been given that the thing she had done might outrun her own fence, might teach a lesson to ground she would never walk. The best harvest off this field, she thought, watching his dust thin on the road, might turn out to be the one I never have to pick. Word of the green had reached the county before she was ready for it to. She had known it would. A thing cannot rise 2 acres wide beside a public road and stay a secret however carefully a person cups the flame of it. The feed store boy saw it first, the same boy who had carried the first tale to town, and this time he did not slow the cart so much as stop it dead in the road, staring over the fence at the wide, dark leaves where 6 weeks before there had been only broken clay. He did not call out to her. He turned the cart and drove hard back the way he had come, and she understood that the county's story about her was about to change its shape, though not she suspected its cruelty. She was right on both counts. The first neighbor to come after the Greens showed came not to laugh but to argue which was worse. He was a lean, sour man named Pruitt, who farmed a middling stretch north of the Hartzell place, and he leaned on her fence with the aggrieved air of a person who has been personally cheated by another's good fortune. "That's not your doing," he told her, jerking his chin at the field. That's a wet spring and dumb luck, and it'll burn off the first hard week of August, you mark me. She did not argue with him. She had learned that arguing with a man determined to be right was a way of handing him exactly the fight he had come for. It might burn off, she allowed, and let the mildness of it rob him of his heat. Or it might not. Either way, I'll know more come August than either of us knows today. He worked his jaw a moment, finding no purchase in her calm, and pushed off the fence and left. But the thing she noticed after Prewitt had gone was not his anger. It was the shape underneath it. The county had been able to laugh at her while she was failing, because failure confirmed everything they already believed about dead ground and foolish girls and last dollars thrown into graves. Success was another matter. Success accused them. If the field could come back, then every man who had walked past it for 2 years and called it finished had been wrong, not about her, but about the land itself, about the limits of what patience and attention could ask of the earth. And a man will forgive you almost anything, she thought, watching Prewitt's dust settle on the road, sooner than he will forgive you for proving him lazy. The colonel did not come in June. That was its own kind of message. He let the green stand there beside the road for the whole of a month, visible to anyone who passed his gate on the way to town. And he said nothing, made no ride to her fence, offered no fresh prophecy of her ruin. She understood the silence for what it was. He was waiting for August the same as Prewitt, but where Prewitt wanted her failure to soothe his pride, the colonel wanted her failure to clear his path. He had told her plainly at her fence in the spring what he meant to do with the parcel once she went under. He was a patient man in the way that wealthy men can afford to be patient, and he had decided to let the weather do his arguing for him. She learned of his particular patience by accident on a July afternoon in Dunmore. She had come in for nails and a new file, nothing that touched the field, and she was at the counter settling the small bill when two men she did not know spoke behind her, not troubling to lower their voices because they did not know her for who she was. Hartzell's already been to the bank about the Merrick South parcel, one of them offered. Put money down against it, they say, so nobody else can move on it before the girl folds. The other laughed. Won't be a long wait. She kept her eyes on the file in her hand and her face still, and she paid Thorne his coin and walked out into the glare, and it was only when she reached the wagon that she let herself feel the size of what she had heard. He had already moved. That was the thing that turned in her chest the whole drive home. Not fear exactly, but a cold clarity that settled over the fear and pressed it flat. The colonel had not been idly wishing her under. He had been buying the ground out from beneath her before she had failed, so certain of that failure that he was willing to lay down real money against a thing that had not yet happened. The south parcel, the 5 acres she had been dropping coins into a tin for the ground she had looked at for years, the way a body looks at a thing already half its own, was being quietly reserved for the man who had laughed loudest at the fairgrounds. She had thought the race was between her and the dead field. She understood now that it had always been between her and Hartzell's certainty, and that he had a great deal more money to spend on being certain than she had to spend on being right. She did one thing about the colonel's money that she told no one, not even herself, in so many words until it was done. She drove the 2 counties over to the bank that held the south parcel on a day she could ill afford to lose to the road, and she sat across a desk from a spectacled man who handled the ground of broken families for a living, and she asked him plainly what it would take to buy the 5 acres out from under Hartzell's reservation. He looked at her patched coat and her split hands and the dust of the long road on her, and he named a figure, and then he named the further figure of what the colonel had already put down against it, and the arithmetic was as cruel as she had feared. She could not touch it. Not with the tin on the shelf, not with the summer's saved coins, not with anything she owned or could borrow against a field the bank had never heard of. She thanked the man and rose to go. He stopped her at the door with a thing she had not expected, spoken low, almost against his own interest. The reservation's not a sale, he told her. Money down holds a thing, but it doesn't close it. If someone were to come to me before the fall with the full price in hand, the ground would go to the full price and the colonel would get his money back and nothing else. She stood in the doorway and took that in. It was not hope exactly. It was the narrow shape hope takes when it has been pared down to a single hard possibility. She thanked him again, and this time she meant it to the bone, and she drove the long road home with a figure fixed in her head that was larger than any sum she had ever held, and a field behind her that had just begun to set its fruit. She did not sleep well that night. She lay in the dark hearing the two strangers' laughter, and beneath it the older laughter of the auction yard, and beneath that the murmur of every neighbor who had leaned on her fence to pity her. And for the first time since the spring, she felt the whole weight of the county pressing down on the small green thing she was trying to grow. Then some hour past midnight, she got up and went out to the field in her nightclothes with a lantern, the way a person goes to sit with someone who is ill, and she walked the rows in the lantern light and put her hand to the broad leaves and found them cool and firm and alive, and the panic went out of her by degrees. He can put money down on the ground, she thought, kneeling in the dark between the vines. He can't put money down on the rain or the sun or what these plants have already decided to do. The one thing his money can't buy is the only thing that's going to settle this. She went back to bed and slept. She crossed paths with the colonel himself a few days later in the middle of Dunmore, in front of half the town. She had come in for a coil of wire, and he was coming out of the bank as she passed it, and there was no avoiding the meeting without one of them plainly turning to flee, which neither of them would do. He touched his hat brim to her with an exaggerated courtliness that was its own small insult meant to be seen by the men loitering on the bank steps. "Miss Merrick," he offered loud enough to carry, "I hear your weeds are coming along." She stopped and faced him because a woman who scurries past a thing has already conceded it, and she had conceded nothing. "They're pumpkins, Colonel," she told him. "Level and clear, and they're coming along fine, which I expect you already know, since a man doesn't put money down at a bank on ground he thinks is going to stay worthless." The words landed. She watched them land, watched the loitering men go still, and their eyes cut toward him to see how he would take being called out in the open street by a girl in a patch coat. He recovered smoothly, as wealthy men do, with a laugh that did not reach his eyes. "A prudent man hedges against a fool's luck," he said. "That's all that is." "Then I'm sure you won't mind losing your hedge," she answered, "when the luck turns out to be something else." And she inclined her head to him, the exact courteous degree he had given her, no more, and walked on into the feed store, and did not look back to see his face because she did not need to. She had learned that the surest way to unsettle a proud man was to treat him with precisely the politeness he was pretending to extend to her, and to let the whole street watch her do it. She paid for her wire and carried it out and loaded it into the wagon with her hands perfectly steady, though her heart was going hard under her ribs, because a public thing was a dangerous thing and she knew it. She had made the colonel small in front of men whose good opinion he lived on, and a man like that did not forgive being made small. She had known it even as she did it, and she had done it anyway, because there are moments when a person has to choose between being safe and being seen, and she had spent too much of her life unseen to let the chance go by. Let him stew on it, she thought, taking up the reins. He started this in front of a crowd. I only finished it the same way. July burned on. The heat that Prewitt had promised would kill the field arrived in force in the second week, a run of white-skied days when the mercury climbed past anything the county had seen in years, and the shallow-rooted crops on the good ground east of the road began here and there to wilt and curl. She watched the Hartzell corn from her own fence line in the evenings, and she saw it suffer, saw the long leaves roll tight against the drought, the way corn does when it is spending more water than it can draw, and she felt no satisfaction in it, only a growing careful wonder at what stood in contrast on her own 2 acres. Because her field did not wilt. That was the thing she could scarcely believe, standing at the fence in the killing heat with the sweat running down her spine. The soil her animals had opened and turned and fed through the spring held its moisture the way the packed clay never could have drank in the little rain that fell, and kept it, and the pumpkin vines, deep-rooted now into ground that had been made ready for them, took the heat and turned it to growth. While the colonel's corn suffered on soil no one had ever had to fight, for her once-dead field thrived on the heat that was meant to finish it. The land that everyone wrote off, she thought, has become the only land in the county that isn't afraid of the sun. She did not say this to anyone, but others began to see it, and their seeing changed the weather of the county's talk more surely than any word she could have offered. Men who drove the road on their way to town began to slow at her fence, not to laugh now, and not quite to argue, but to look with the uneasy, calculating expression of people revising a thing they had held as settled. She marked the change without letting it move her. She had learned in the spring not to warm herself at the county's opinion because an opinion that could swing toward her on the strength of a green leaf could swing back on the strength of a bad frost, and she meant to keep her footing on ground steadier than that. The vines ran wild through the back half of July. They took the field the way a tide takes a flat shore without hurry and without any announcement, until the old rose vanished beneath a canopy of leaves wide as spread hands, and the pale split ground of spring lay buried under a green so deep and serious it seemed to hold the light rather than reflect it. She could hear the field now on a windy afternoon from the barn door, a dry, papery rustle as the breeze moved through the great leaves, and she had come to find the sound the most companionable thing on the farm, better than the well pump, better than the low talk of the animals in their pen. Then on a still morning near the end of the month, the flowers opened. They came first at the ends of the longest, boldest vines, trumpet-shaped and startling, in their yellow standing up out of the leaves in the early light, and closing again as the day's heat came down. More followed over the days that came scattered through the rows in a spreading gold, until on one calm morning the whole field was pricked with them, the way a meadow goes bright after rain. She crouched at the fence a long while just to look at them, asking nothing, doing nothing, and she felt for a moment she did not try to hold on to something very close to joy, which was an emotion she had grown so unused to that she almost failed to recognize its face. The moment she had moved the animals off the field for good came sooner than she had planned, forced on her by the very success she had worked for. By the last days of July, the vines had claimed enough ground that the daily rooting did more harm than good, tearing at established roots, crushing young fruit before it had a chance to set. She built a proper pen for them in the corner nearest the barn, and she moved them into it on a warm evening, and they went reluctantly in the mild, stubborn way of animals, being asked to leave a place they have decided is theirs, and had to be coaxed the last of the distance with a bucket and more patience than she had to spare. Once penned, they showed no lasting grief. They had done the thing they were made to do, though none of them would ever know it, and now the field would carry on the work without them. She stood at the new pen's rail that evening and looked back across the ground the animals had made, and she let herself feel the strangeness of it. 34 creatures nobody had wanted bought with a last dollar in front of a laughing crowd had walked through 2 acres of death and left life behind them in every print, and they would never understand what they had done, would go to their own ends, knowing only that a girl had once fed them and moved them from pen to pen and let them do the one thing that came naturally. I owe them more than I'll ever be able to say, she thought, watching them settle against one another in the dusk, and the debt is the kind you can only pay forward, never back. August came in heavy and slow, the air thick enough to lean against. The mornings were white before they turned blue, and by noon the whole county baked under a sun that made the far fields tremble and run like water. She had shifted her hours hard toward the cool edges of the day, working the barn and the pen and the endless small repairs before the heat built, resting in the shade through the flat middle hours, coming out again only when the light went long and forgiving in the late afternoon. The field asked less of her now than it had at any point since the spring. It had passed beyond the stage where her labor could help it into the stage where it needed only to be let alone, and watched, and she found she did not entirely know what to do with the watching. She slept little in the days before she would load the first wagon, not from fear now, but from a coiled readiness that would not let her rest. And she woke each of those mornings already counting the road, the market, the buyers, the price. The field had done its part, past all doubting. What remained was hers alone to carry, and she meant to carry it clean. The first small fruit appeared not long after the flowers had spent themselves pale green, and no larger than her closed fist, swelling slowly from the base of each wilted bloom where the vines ran thickest. She found the first one on an evening walk through the rows, and crouched over it a long time, not touching it, the way she had not touched the first shoot back in the spring, out of the same superstition that a thing looked at too boldly might take fright and fail. She counted 7 of them that first evening. 3 days later, she counted 20 and lost her place in the counting, and she made herself stop because she had learned twice already that summer that the field's arithmetic ran past anything her fear or her hope could usefully total, and that she was better off leaving the sums to the ground. It was in the second week of August that the colonel finally came. She heard the good bay on the road before she saw it, the easy walking gait of a horse whose owner had never in his life been in a hurry, and she did not go to the fence to meet him, but she watched from where she worked near the barn. He drew up where the field was most visible at the point where the vines ran closest to the wire, and the young fruit sat thickest under the leaves, and he sat his saddle a long moment and looked. She could see his face in part turned toward the ground he had put money down to own, and there was something working in it that she could not fully read at that distance, though it was plainly not the amusement he had worn in the spring. He did not call to her across the fence. He did not offer a fresh prophecy or a friendly warning or an insult dressed as concern. He sat his horse in silence and looked at the field for what felt even from the barn. Like a very long time, the silence of a man doing arithmetic he had been sure he would never have to do. Then he gathered his reins and clicked his tongue to the bay and rode on toward his own suffering corn, and she turned back to her work, and neither of them had said a word, and a great deal had passed between them all the same. He came to laugh, she thought, watching the dust of him settle, and found there was nothing left to laugh at, and I think that frightened him more than any words of mine ever could. She understood watching him go that his silence was the most dangerous thing he had yet shown her. A man who mocks you has decided you are beneath his effort. A man who goes quiet has begun to take you seriously, and a serious Hartzell was a Hartzell who would not simply wait for the weather anymore. He had money down on the south parcel, and a growing suspicion that the weather was not going to hand him her ruin after all, and a man in that position, she knew, starts to look for other ways to get what he has already paid for. She did not know yet what shape that would take. She only knew with the same cold clarity that had come to her on the road home from Dunmore that the contest was entering a new and harder season, and that the fields coming back to life had not ended the danger but sharpened it. The proof of it came within the week. She woke one morning to find a section of her fence down along the roadside, 3 panels pushed flat the wire she had strained so carefully in the spring, lying trampled in the dust, and for one lurching moment she thought the animals had gotten loose again. Then she saw that the pen in the corner stood sound, the 34 accounted for, and she understood that whatever had come through her fence in the night had come from the outside, not the inn. The prints in the soft ground told the rest. A horse shod had been walked back and forth along the down section. In the fruit nearest the road, a dozen of the largest and best-set young pumpkins had been crushed under hoof deliberately, in a pattern no stray animal would ever have made. She stood over the ruined vines a long while, her hands loose at her sides, feeling the anger come up in her slow and hot, and then with an effort she was proud of later, feeling herself set it down. She could not prove whose horse had done it. She could guess, and her guess was a certainty in everything, but the kind of proof a man could be made to answer for. But a guess was not a thing she could carry to anyone in that county who would act on it, least of all against the man who held its money and its good opinion in his gloved hand. To accuse him without proof would be to hand the whole county the story it wanted the wild girl crying foul when her luck turned, and she would not do it. So she did the only thing the ruined fence left her to do. She mended it. She spent the better part of that day restraining the trampled wire, driving fresh stakes deeper than before, doubling the line along the road, side where a horse might most easily be walked. And she said nothing to anyone, made no complaint at the mill, filed no word with the county man. She let the silence answer the silence. If he wants this ground badly enough to sneak onto it in the dark and crush what a girl has grown, she thought, tamping the last new stake home in the failing light, then he has already told me the one thing I most needed to know, which is that he no longer believes I'm going to fail on my own. The realization steadied her more than it frightened her. A man does not trouble to sabotage a thing he expects to die of its own accord. The crushed vines, ugly as they were a kind of testimony, an admission wrung out of the colonel's own fear and printed in hoof marks across her ground that the field had already won the argument the weather was supposed to settle. She lost the dozen fruit he had ruined. The field carried 100 more that his horse had never reached, set thick under the leaves, clear back to the barn's shadow swelling day on day toward a harvest she could feel coming now, the way you feel a season turning in the body before the mind. She doubled her watchfulness after that. She took to sleeping lightly, a habit she despised, and could not shake, waking at every shift of wind against the barn, at every stir of the animals in their pen, half expecting each time to rise and find fresh ruin along the road. It did not come again in the same form, but the vigilance it left behind caught something all the same. On a moonless night, near the end of August, she woke to the animals' low, uneasy grunting. a sound she had learned to read the way a mother reads a child's cough, and she was out of the house with the lantern unlit and her father's old shotgun broken open over her arm before she had fully decided to move. She did not fire it. She never even closed it. She only stood at the corner of the barn in the dark and let herself be seen, a still shape against the pale boards. And out along the roadside, she heard a horse take a startled step, and then a rider check it, and then the slow, careful retreat of someone who had come expecting an empty yard and found a watching one instead. She never saw his face. She did not need to. She stood in the cold until the sound of him had gone entirely from the night, and then she stood a while longer because she had learned that the worst thing a person can do after facing down a fear is to turn her back on it too soon. In the morning, she found where the horse had stood, the prints fresh in the soft ground along the doubled fence stopped short of the wire, this time turned and gone. He had not gotten through. The doubled line and the deeper stakes had made the roadside too slow to breach quietly, and her waking had made the yard too dangerous to try. She felt no triumph in it, only a grim, tired steadiness. A man will come back to a thing he wants until you make the wanting cost more than he's willing to pay, she thought, running her thumb along the sound top wire. I can't outspend him, but I can make him afraid of being seen, and a proud man fears that worse than any loss. She left the shotgun leaning inside the barn door after that unloaded, where her hand could find it in the dark, and the roadside stayed quiet the rest of the season, and she never learned whether it was the fence, or the watching, or the man's own dwindling nerve that kept it so. The days ran down toward the end of August in a green so total that a stranger driving the road would never have believed the ground had been called dead within living memory. The vines had covered every inch of the old rows, leaf lapping leaf, and beneath that canopy the fruit swelled in secret pale green, giving way by slow degrees toward the deeper color that meant the work was nearly done. She walked the rows every evening now, not to labor, but to bear witness, lifting a leaf here and there, to check a vine pressing 2 fingers into the dark soil, to read its moisture, and each evening the ground gave back the same answer it had given all summer, that it was loose and rich, and alive, transformed past any resemblance to the shut and starving clay of spring. The soil was the thing she kept coming back to more even than the fruit. Anyone who had ever farmed could have knelt at the edge of that field and felt the difference with the flat of a hand. What had been pale and tight and dead was dark and open, and full of small movement threaded through with the fine white roots and the working life that turns dirt into ground a crop can love. The animals had done exactly what she had trusted them to do through the whole doubtful spring, and they had done it more thoroughly than she had dared to hope, and the proof of it now lay in every square foot of the 2 acres in soil so changed that she sometimes crouched and lifted a handful simply to remind herself it was the same field. She thought often through those last August evenings of her father. Silas had worked this ground when it still gave, had believed in it. Past all, reason had died with its failure fresh against him, and no way of knowing that the failure was not the end of the story. She wished in a way that surprised her with its sharpness that he could have seen the field as it stood now, could have knelt at its edge and felt with his own paper-light hand what the ground had done, what she had helped it do. He would not have said much. He had never said much. But he would have pressed his palm to the warm, dark earth and held it there a long moment, and that from Silas Merrick had always meant more than any speech. Gideon Thorne came out to the fence once more in that last stretch of August, and the manner of his coming told her more than his words did. He did not come up the lane with the careful, sparing tread of a man braced to deliver hard sense. He came slowly, stopping at the wire, and he stood a long while looking at the great canopy of vines and the pale fruit swelling thick beneath the leaves, clear back to the barn before he said anything at all. I sold your father his last lime, he told her finally, and there was something in his voice she had not heard from him before, closer to apology than to counsel. Told him the same thing I told you in the spring, that there is a point past which ground doesn't come back. She waited because she could see he had more in him to say, and was working himself up to the saying of it. Looks like I've been wrong about that twice now, he went on, once with him and once with you. And a man my age doesn't like to learn he's been carrying a wrong thing around for 30 years. She did not gloat. She had no use for the pleasure of it. You weren't wrong about most ground, she told him, and meant it. You were only wrong about this ground and about what a stubborn girl and 34 hogs would do to it. He gave a short breath that was almost a laugh, the first she had ever drawn out of him, and he told her he would want to hear. Come winter, exactly how she had done it, because there were other fields in the county, past the easy cures, and he was tired of telling their owners to sell. She said she would tell him gladly. He had fronted her feed when no other man in Dunmore would risk $1 on her, and she did not forget a debt like that. And she found she was glad past all the summer's hardness to have him standing at her fence as something nearer to an ally than a mourner. She began in those last cool evenings to make ready for a harvest larger than anything she had ever had to bring in alone. She dragged her father's old market wagon out of the back of the barn where it had sat since his death and worked 2 days on its dry rotted boards and its seized axle, greasing and hammering and replacing until it would carry weight again without groaning apart on the county road. She sorted through the barn for every basket and crate and length of sound sacking she owned and found it was not enough, not by half, for the crop she could see setting in the field. She would have to make more than one trip to the market. She would have to time it against the weather, against the first hard frost that would sweeten the fruit, but also mark the end of the season's grace, and against the market days themselves, which came only so often and drew only so many buyers. The growing had asked patience of her. The harvest, she understood, would ask something harder, a kind of relentless, clear-headed hurry, and she made her plans by lantern light with the care of a woman who knew that the whole summer's work could still be lost in a bad week of hauling. The change she had been waiting for all summer came when it came, the way the largest changes on a farm always come, not while she watched for it, but in the one interval she looked away. She had gone to bed on an evening in the last stretch of the month, with the field still green and heavy-leaved, carrying its swelling weight in secret, under the canopy of vines, and she had slept for once the whole night through. She woke before first light in the September cold, stepped out onto the porch to draw the morning's first water, and stopped where she stood because even in the gray before dawn she could see that something in the field had changed overnight, a new color spreading low through the dark, warm and deep, like a fire banked and glowing under ash. She made herself wait for full light before she walked out to the fence, though the waiting cost her more than she would have admitted, and when she reached the wire at last, she stopped and stood with her hands hanging at her sides. Orange. Everywhere across the 2 acres orange. Not one, not the scattered dozens she had been counting through August, but pumpkins past all counting, sitting heavy and round in the pale new light, their skins hardened overnight from green toward that deep and undeniable color. That means the fruit is finished, that the work is done, that the thing a person has hoped for has quietly become a thing that is real. They ran along the fence line and back through the heart of the field and clear to where the cold shadow of the barn wall fell across the ground, some the size of a man's chest, some larger, the spent vines threading brown between them, having given everything they had. She counted because counting was the oldest habit her fear had, the same way she had once counted 34 frightened animals in a cold auction pen. She reached 100 and had not covered half the field, and she stopped, and she did not make a sound. She stood at the fence with her split hands resting on the top wire and let the whole size of it come into her at once. The death and the buying and the laughter, the trampled fence and the crushed fruit, and the colonel's money lying against her ground. 2 counties away, all of it answered now in a single night by more fruit than the county had seen come off any 2 acres in a decade. The field that everyone buried, she thought, standing in the cold with the sun just breaking, has just dug itself out of the grave, and it did it loud enough to be heard from the road. She let herself do at last the arithmetic she had been afraid to attempt all summer. She multiplied what lay before her against what a sound pumpkin would fetch at the Dunmore market in an autumn when the crop ran short, which this autumn plainly did, the colonel's own scorched corn being proof enough of it. The figure she arrived at was not a certain one. Markets were fickle, and 100 small disasters could still fall between a field and a sale. But it was large enough if the weather held its hand and the fruit carried clean, and she could get the whole of it to town before the season closed to reach the sum the spectacled man had fixed in her head across his desk, 2 counties over. The ground he laughed at, she thought, the sums running quiet behind her eyes, might be about to buy the ground he was so sure he had already won. She did not let herself believe it all the way down. She had learned not to trust a harvest until it was sold, and the coin lay cold in her palm. But she let herself see it once whole and clear, and then she folded the seeing away and went to ready what she would need, because a crop that size would take more hauling than she had standing, and the season had left her no hours to spend on doubt. She did not let herself stand at the fence marveling for long. Marveling was a luxury for people whose work was finished, and hers had only changed its shape overnight, from waiting into hauling. The frost that had turned the skins hard would come again harder within days, and after the frost, the rot, and after the rot, the whole summer would run out through her fingers like water through the cracked clay she had labored all season to close. She turned from the orange and went to the barn while the sun was still low, and she did not come out again except to load because a harvest that size brought in alone would not wait on wonder. The picking was heavier work than any she had done that year. Heavier than the fence, heavier than hauling the animals up from the wash in the spring. Each pumpkin had to be cut from its spent vine, lifted with both arms against her chest, carried the length of the row to where the wagon stood, and set down without dropping, because a cracked fruit was a fruit no buyer would touch. She learned within the first hour to spare her back by bending at the knee the way her father had bent, and within the second hour, her arms had gone past aching into a dull, numb obedience that let her keep moving. She filled the market wagon until its old boards groaned against the weight, and then she filled the salvage crates lashed behind it, and when both were full to the limit of what the team could pull, she looked back across the field and saw that she had cleared barely a corner of it. That was the moment the true size of the harvest came home to her, not as triumph, but as a problem she would have to solve against the clock. One wagon would not do it. 2 trips would not do it. She stood in the low morning light doing the arithmetic of hauling the way she had once done, the arithmetic of hunger, and she understood that she would be on the road to Dunmore and back for the better part of a week, that she would be racing the frost and the rot and her own exhaustion the whole distance, and that the market itself would only draw buyers on its appointed days, which gave her a narrower window than the field's abundance had any right to expect. A poor harvest, she thought, hoisting another fruit against her chest, breaks your heart in the spring. A great one breaks your back in the fall. She had learned to prefer the second kind of breaking. It was the only kind that paid. She drove the first load into town before the following dawn, working by lantern light to load the last of it in the cold dark, lifting each pumpkin with a care that had nothing sentimental in it and everything practical, because a fruit that rolled loose on the county road was a fruit lost to the ditch. The team leaned into the traces against the unfamiliar weight, their breath standing white in the frozen air, and the old wagon left 2 dark lines in the frost of the road where its wheels cut through. She sat straight on the bench with her hands quiet in her lap and watched the sky go from black to gray to the palest gold above the tree line, and she felt none of the dread that had ridden with her to the auction in the spring. The fear had spent itself somewhere in the long summer of not knowing. What sat in its place was something plainer and far steadier, the settled calm of a woman who had already done the hard part and now had only to carry it through. She reached the market square at the edge of Dunmore before the other sellers had finished arranging their tables, and she claimed a place at the near end where the morning traffic would pass it first, and she began to build. She did not simply stack the pumpkins. She built them into a mound, the largest at the base, and the smaller graded up the sides, until the whole of it caught the eye of anyone entering the square, from half a block off a wall of deep autumn orange, where the week before there had been only the gray of a town bracing for a hard winter and a short harvest. She had learned something about the county over the summer that she put to use now, without quite naming it to herself, that people who would never believe a rumor would believe their own eyes, and that the surest argument she could make for what her dead field had done was to pile the proof of it high enough to stop a man in the street. It stopped them. The first townsfolk to walk the square that morning slowed as they passed her mound, the way people slowed a thing that does not fit the shape of the day they expected. Then they stopped altogether. Then they came closer, drawn by the plain impossibility of that much good fruit in a season everyone had already written off as lean, and by mid-morning a steady knot had gathered at her table, and by midday the knot had become a line. She worked without hurry through the whole of it, cutting no corner, stacking, weighing by eye, making change from the small tin she had carried empty into that same town in the spring, and now filled coin by coin with a return on a last dollar and 34 unwanted animals. She heard what people said to one another as they waited, and she let it pass through her without letting it turn her head. Some she knew for neighbors who had leaned on her fence in the spring to pity her and said nothing all summer as the green came up, and who now bought her pumpkins with a sheepishness they could not quite hide. Some she had never laid eyes on, drawn in from the far corners of the county by a week of talk. All of them looked at the mound the same way, with the particular startled respect people reserve for a thing they were certain could not be done, and are now holding in their own two hands. She did not gloat, and she did not explain, and she did not once mention the auction yard, or the laughter, or the dead field by name. The fruit said all of it for her more plainly than she ever could have, and it charged nothing for the saying. Prewitt came through the square in the middle of that first afternoon, the sour neighbor who had promised her the heat would burn the whole thing off by August. He did not come to her table. He passed it at a distance, slowing just enough to take in the mound, in the line waiting at it, and she watched him do the arithmetic behind his eyes, watched him weigh the wet spring and dumb luck story he had told himself against the plain orange evidence stacked higher than his own head, and watched the story lose. He did not tip his hat to her. He did not come and buy. He only looked and moved on, and she understood that a man like Prewitt would go to his grave preferring to believe in luck than to admit he had called a thing dead that a girl had known how to bring back. Some men would rather be unlucky than wrong, she thought, watching him go. It cost them less. The feed store man came late in the day when the light had begun to slant gold across the square, and her mound had shrunk by better than half. Gideon Thorne stood at the edge of her table a long, quiet moment, and then he picked up one of the smaller pumpkins and turned it over in his broad hands the way a man turns over an idea he has carried too long and is only now setting down. He did not haggle. He did not need the fruit. He grew his own. He set his coins on the board with a deliberateness that had nothing to do with the price, and when he looked up at her, his face had lost the last of the cautious weighing she had known in it all these years. "I've sold seed in this county 40 years," he told her, "and I've never once watched a piece of ground come back from where yours was. I'd have bet the store against it. I'm glad I didn't have to pay." She thanked him for coming, and she meant more by the thanks than the words carried, because he had been the one man to lay $1 of credit on her when the whole town was laying only laughter, and they both knew it, and neither of them said it because some debts are best acknowledged in the not saying. Near the end of that first market day, when her table stood more empty than full, and she had begun to think of the long, dark drive home and the loading she would do again before dawn, the colonel came. She heard no horse this time. He came on foot across the square, and he did not look at the line or the dwindling mound or the tin heavy in her hands. He looked at her. He selected a pumpkin, the largest that remained on her table, and he set his coins on the board beside it with a care that was almost formal, the care of a man performing a thing he has decided he must do and means to do properly. Then he spoke to her the way one farmer speaks to another when there is no longer anything to prove between them and nothing left to doubt. "I was wrong about your ground," he told her, and the words came out plain and unhurried, a man's admission and not a boy's excuse. "I was wrong about you. I've farmed the best soil in this county my whole life, and never once had to think about what makes it good. You took the worst and made it better than mine, and I don't fully understand how, and that's a thing I'm not used to saying." She did not answer at once. She had rehearsed no speech, for this had not let herself believe the moment would come, and now that it stood in front of her, she found she had no wish to make it smaller by crowing over it. "You put money down on my south parcel," she told him at last, keeping her voice level because the thing had to be said between them, and this was the moment for it. "Before I'd even failed. You were so sure." He held her eye, and to his credit, he did not flinch from it. "I was," he admitted. "I'll withdraw it." He said it simply, a debt he was choosing to pay in full, and she understood that whatever else the man was, he was not a coward about his own defeats, which was more than she could have said for Prewitt. "I've already been to the bank about it," she told him. "So had you, it turns out, before me." There was a silence between them then that was not quite friendly and not quite hostile. The silence of two people who had fought over a piece of ground and were both still standing at the end of it. Then he asked her the only question that mattered to either of them anymore. He asked what she had done with the soil. She told him. She told him the whole of it, standing there in the emptying square with the gold light going to gray, the pigs and the rooting and the old buried seeds, and the long patient work of letting a living thing do what iron could only mimic. And he listened the way she had never once been listened to by any man in that county, with his whole attention bent on the thing itself and not on the strangeness of hearing it from her. When she had finished, he was quiet a moment, and then he nodded slow, the way a man nods when he has been handed a thing he will be turning over for a long while, He tucked the pumpkin under one arm, and he thanked her, and he walked away across the square, and she watched him go with the last of the day's light on his back, and that was enough. She did not need him humbled. She had only needed him to stop being able to laugh, and the field had seen to that months ago. The words at her table were merely the man catching up to what his own eyes had already told him. He turned back to her before he had gone 3 steps, as if a thing had occurred to him that he could not carry home, and said, "There's other ground in this county worked as hard as yours was," he told her. "Mine's good, but I've a low 40 by the creek that's gone sour on me these 3 years, and I've thrown money at it the way a man throws money at a thing he doesn't understand." He paused, and she saw the pride cost him the next of it. "I'd pay you to do to it what you did to yours. Name a figure." It was a handsome offer, and they both knew it, an open door into the kind of steady money she had never once had. The wealthy man's hand extended at last to lift her up beside him. She turned it over a moment out of respect, because a fair offer deserved a fair weighing. Then she shook her head. "I won't hire out my pigs to fix what your carelessness broke," she told him without heat, only plainly. "But I'll tell you how to do it yourself, the same as I'd tell any man who came to my fence and asked instead of laughing." That was the price, and it was no price at all, and she watched him understand that she had just refused his money and offered him the very thing he tried to buy, and that the refusal had cost her nothing because she had never wanted to be lifted up beside him. She had only ever wanted to stand on her own ground. He took it the way a proud man takes a lesson he has earned, with a stiff nod and a long look, and this time when he walked away he did not turn back. She drove home in this dark that night with an empty wagon and a heavy tin, and she loaded again before dawn, and she made the run to Dunmore 3 more times over the days that followed, racing the frost that came each night a little harder and the rot that waited just behind it. On the 4th loading, in the black hour before dawn, she looked up from the wagon bed to find the young farmer standing at the edge of her yard with his own team and cart, come the long way around in the dark without being asked. He did not make a speech of it. He only said he figured a crop that had taught him something was worth an early morning to help bring in, and he rolled up his sleeves and set to loading beside her, the two of them lifting the heavy fruit in a silence that needed nothing added to it. She let him help. That was its own small victory over herself, the letting, because a year of standing alone had taught her hands to refuse every offer before her mouth could shape a thank you, and she made herself unclench them now. They cleared and loaded both her wagon and his cart before the sun broke, and he drove the second load into Dunmore behind her and would take no coin for it. And she understood, as she watched his cart fall in behind hers on the frozen road, that the county she had known all her life was quietly rearranging itself around what she had done. Help had come after all. It had only waited until she had proven she did not need it, which was, she supposed, the way help usually came to people like her. She did not mind the timing. A hand offered late is still a hand, she thought, and it is a great deal more honest than the ones that only reach for you once you are already standing. The market drew a fresh crowd each of its days, word having traveled now clear to the county's edges, and she sold everything she brought every trip, the mound melting away under the hands of buyers who came, as much to say they had bought from the dead field as to carry home a pumpkin. The young farmer who had come to her fence in July with his hat in his hands found her at the market on the 3rd day, and the finding of him there gladdened her more than any coin she took that afternoon. He had brought his young wife to see the mound for himself, and he stood at her table turning a small pumpkin in his hands, and he told her he had gone home after their July talk and turned his 4 worst hogs onto his worst half-acre, not fully believing, only desperate enough to try. It's too soon to know, he admitted, the hope and the fear still wrestling in his young face the way they had at her fence. But the ground's darker where they've worked it. I put my hand down last week and it gave where it never gave before. She looked at him a moment, at the wife beside him, and the careful way he held the fruit, and she felt something she had not expected to feel in that square, which was the quiet satisfaction of a thing outliving its maker. "Keep at it," she told him. "Don't let anyone rush you off it, and don't rush it yourself. The ground took 2 hard years to trust me. It'll take its own time trusting you." He nodded, and he bought the pumpkin, though he plainly grew his own the way a man buys a thing to keep his proof, and he took his wife's arm and went, and she watched them go and understood that the field had grown something beyond fruit that summer, something that would go on rooting in ground she would never see. "The best of what I made here," she thought, "is already walking off to a farm I'll never lay eyes on." She did not raise her prices to punish the ones who had laughed. She charged every buyer the same fair figure, the ones who had pitied her and the ones who had never doubted because she had decided somewhere in the long summer that she would not let the county's smallness make her small in turn, and because a fair price paid by a humbled man tasted better to her than a gouging one. The men who had laughed at the fairgrounds in the spring came back into her life over those market days, not all at once, but in ones and twos, and each of them wore his reckoning differently. The auctioneer who had taken her $31 with something like apology in his face sought her out at her table on the second afternoon, and he told her with a dry countryman's humor that he had called 10,000 lots in his years at the yard and never once watched a buyer make a fool of the whole crowd the way she had. "I wrote your receipt in pencil thinking I'd never see the like again," he told her. "Turns out I was witnessing the best buy anybody made at my yard in 20 years, and I near talked you out of it." She did not correct him, though the buy had been no accident and no luck because there was no unkindness in him, and a man allowed to feel he had witnessed a wonder is a man who will tell the story generously. Others were harder to stomach. A pair of the men who had stood near the colonel and laughed with him came to her table together, all warmth, now telling her they had known all along there was something to her, that they had said as much to each other at the time. She let them buy their pumpkins and say their piece and go, and she did not remind them of what they had actually said in the spring, because the fruit remembered it for her, and because a person who rewrites her own past to your face is not worth the breath of correction. One thing she would not let stand. On the last market day, a man she knew for one of the county's landholders, a friend of Hartzell's with acreage of his own, came to her table not to buy, but to make her an offer. And the offer was to purchase her 2 acres outright, at a price that would have seemed a fortune to the girl who drove into the auction yard in the spring. He named it the way a man names a favor he is doing you, as though the chance to be rid of the ground she had bled a year into were a kindness. She heard him out. Then she told him no, and she told him why plainly enough that he would not mistake it for haggling. "This ground was dead when it was mine," she said, "and everyone in this county, including you, was glad to let me keep it. It's alive now, and now you want it. The answer's the same answer I gave the colonel's horse in the dark. It isn't for sale, and it isn't for taking, and the only way onto it is the way that young farmer took, which is to come to the fence and ask how not what." He reddened and gathered himself and left, and she understood that the county's laughter had curdled into something more dangerous than mockery, which was appetite, and that she would spend the rest of her life on that ground, guarding what she had made from men who had scorned it until the moment it was worth coveting. Let them covet, she thought, watching him go. Coveting's just respect that showed up too late to matter. An old woman she did not know bought 2 pumpkins from her on the last day, counting out her coins, slow with hands more worn than Adeline's own, and she lingered at the table after the sale, the way lonely people linger where there has been warmth. "I heard what they said about you in the spring," the woman told her voice low under the noise of the square. "My husband was one that laughed. He's gone now, this summer past, and I'll tell you a thing he never learned to say. It's a hard county for a woman standing alone in it, and harder still for one who's right when the men are wrong." She patted Adeline's wrapped hand once the way a grandmother pats a child, and gathered her pumpkins and went, and Adeline stood a moment with the unexpected kindness of it caught in her throat. She had armored herself all year against the county's scorn, and had never once thought to armor herself against its tenderness, and the old woman's words got past her guard in a way no laughter ever had. She would remember them longer than she remembered anything the colonel said. To be right when the men are wrong, she thought, was the loneliest thing I did all year, and that old woman is the only soul who named it. She carried the words home with her that night the way she had once carried the crushed animal up from the wash close against her chest, and she found room for them. Somewhere the laughter had never been able to reach. It was a strange thing, she thought, driving the dark road, that a whole county's mockery could roll off her like rain off oilcloth, and a single stranger's kindness could nearly undo her. But that was the shape of a life spent bracing against the wrong weather. You armored the front of you toward the storm you expected, and the tenderness, when it came at all, always came from behind. The second run to Dunmore nearly cost her the whole gamble. She had loaded heavier than the first time, greedy against the frost, and on the long grade a mile short of town, the old market wagon's repaired axle groaned, shuddered, and gave, dropping the near corner into the road with a crack that spilled a dozen pumpkins into the ditch and left the whole load canted and stranded in the gray of first light. She stood a moment in the cold looking at it, the summer's work tilted on a broken wheel with the market opening in an hour, and no soul on that empty road to help her. and she felt the old solitude close over her. The plain fact that had ridden with her since her father died, that help was a rumor and never a certainty, and had best not be waited on. Then she stopped looking at the ruin and started looking at the fix. She unloaded half the wagon into the ditch grass by hand to take the weight off, jacked the broken corner with a fence rail and a stone, the way Silas had shown her when she was 10, and lashed the split axle with a length of the same salvage wire that had built her fence, wrapping it tight and doubling it until it would hold as far as town if she nursed it. A thing that breaks on the road, she thought, cinching the last turn of wire is only lost if you're the kind of person who stands and mourns it. She had stopped being that kind of person in a muddy wash in the spring. She reloaded what the ditch had spilled, checked each fruit for the crack that would have made it worthless, found only 2 past saving, and drove the last mile into Dunmore, at a walk the mended axle groaning under her the whole way, and she made the market with delight. On the last day of the last trip, when the field behind her stood cleared at last of all but the spent vines and the 2 acres of dark rested soil, she folded the cloth from her market table slowly, the way she did most things without hurry, and she counted what remained in the tin after she had set aside what she owed. She counted it twice because the first count seemed too large to trust, and the second count agreed with the first. The number was real. She had carried the figure the bank clerk gave her in her head through every doubting week since July had multiplied fruit against price 100 times in the dark, and now the sum sat there in her palms, solid as a stone pulled from good ground, and it was enough. Not nearly enough. Not close. Enough with a margin over to do the thing she had scarcely let herself name. The week of hauling took a toll on her body that the whole rest of the year had not managed. Her hands, which had toughened past bleeding over the summer, split open again at the knuckle from the endless lifting, and she wrapped them in strips of old sacking each morning and worked through it because there was no one to spare her the work, and no day the frost would grant her to rest. Her back ached in a deep, structural way she had never felt before, the ache of a person asking more of herself than a single body was built to give. And each night she lay down certain she could not rise for another dawn's loading, and each dawn she rose. She had learned something over the summer about the difference between the pain that warns you off a thing and the pain that only accompanies it, and she had learned to tell them apart in the dark, to know which ache meant stop and which meant only that she was doing hard work that mattered. This is the good kind of tired, she told herself one midnight, wrapping her ruined hands by lantern light. The kind you earn on the far side of a thing you were told couldn't be done. She was too honest to pretend it didn't hurt. She was too stubborn to let the hurt decide anything. There came a night in the middle of that hauling week when she could not sleep for the ache, and she got up and sat on the porch step in the cold, the way she had sat there in the spring, when the whole plan was still only a shape in her head, and she looked out at the field, standing more than half cleared under the moon, the pale pumpkins that remained catching the light like stones in a dark stream. She let herself think for the first time since the orange had come about how near the whole thing had run to failure at every turn. The animals loose in the dark on the second night, the killing heat that was meant to burn her out, the colonel's horse crushing her fruit and his money lying against her ground, the broken axle a mile from town. Any one of them might have ended it, and none of them had not, because she had been lucky, but because she had refused at each turn to let the ending arrive. She understood, sitting there, that this was the only kind of victory the world actually handed out. Not the clean kind from stories, but the kind stitched together out of 100 small refusals to quit, and she found she did not mind. A win with no scars on it, she thought, isn't a win. It's a gift, and nobody was ever going to hand me one of those. She paid her debts first the morning after the last market day, walking the length of Dunmore's Main Street to settle every account she had run through the lean spring, the feed store credit and the small bills at the mill, and the 2 years of patience various men had extended her in place of cash. She paid each in full without apology, without explanation, laying the coin on the counter and watching the surprise cross each face as it understood that the girl who had thrown her last dollar into a grave was walking the town clearing her name in hard money. She saved Thorne's account for last, and when she laid the coins on his counter, he shook his head and pushed half of them back, telling her the credit had been a small risk and had cost him nothing, that he'd not take full payment on a bet that had come in. She pushed the coins across the counter again, and she held his eye until he took them. A debt paid short isn't paid, she told him. You backed me when it was foolish to. I won't cheapen that by letting you eat the cost of it now that it's wise. He took the coins. That same afternoon, she walked to the land office at the edge of town, and from there she made the arrangement to drive the two counties over one final time before the roads froze hard to the bank that held the south parcel. She knew the family who had lost the south parcel, though she had never spoken to say so. They had farmed it when she was a girl, a man and his wife, and a string of children, and the same run of failed seasons that had killed her father's field and nearly killed her had taken their ground out from under them a year before it took his life. They had loaded a wagon one gray morning and gone west the way people went when the ground stopped answering, and the bank two counties over had held the empty acres ever since, waiting for a buyer with more sense than sentiment. She thought about them as she drove the price over the county line, about how the same hard years had scattered one family to the territories and left her standing, and she understood that the only difference between their fate and hers had been 34 unwanted animals, and the stubbornness to try a thing the whole county called foolish. It could have been my wagon going west, she thought, watching the road unspool. It was near enough to it. She did not buy the parcel to gloat over their leaving. She bought it because ground that had broken a good family deserved to be brought back rather than left to the weeds, and because she had learned the one trade in the county that could do it. She sat again across the desk from the spectacled man, and this time she set the full price down in front of him in the hard coin the field had earned, and she watched him count it, and she watched him understand. He told her with something that was almost pleasure in his careful voice that the colonel had already withdrawn his money down against the parcel not 3 days prior, so that the ground stood clear and open, waiting only for a full price to close it. She had wondered whether Hartzell would truly do the thing he had said he would do at her market table, whether the admission had been only the graceful noise a beaten man makes in public. He had done it. The reservation was gone. The 5 acres were hers to buy outright, and she bought them, and she signed her name to the deed, in the same careful hand her father had taught her. Adeline Merrick on the parcel of ground she had looked at across her own fence line for years, the way a person looks at a thing that already belongs to them in some way that has not yet been written down. Now it was written, now it was hers. She drove home in the long amber light of that late afternoon with the deed folded flat in the pocket of her father's coat, in the same pocket that had carried $31 into the auction yard in the spring, and she owed nothing to anyone in the world. The realization did not arrive as a shout. It arrived the way the orange had arrived in the field quietly overnight, a thing that had been building unseen and was suddenly undeniably there. She had come into that county site in the spring as a joke, a girl with a dead field and a last dollar and no sense. She was driving home now, a landowner with a name paid clean and a second field under her own hand, and she had done it without borrowing against her future, without cheating a soul, without once raising her voice above the level she had held at the rail of the Piglet pen. She let herself feel the whole weight of it on that drive, the realness of it, and she did not try to make it modest. She had already begun on the drive home to plan the new ground the way her father had taught her to plan, in seasons rather than in weeks. The 5 acres she had bought were worse than her own field had ever been, 3 years sour and gone to weed, and she knew now precisely what they would take. Not the lime and the hired teams the feed store man had once quoted her, but time and animals and the patience to let a living thing walk through the dark and remind the soil what it was. She would need more hogs than 34 to work 5 acres, and she would buy them the same way, cheap and unwanted, the runts nobody else would bid on, because she had learned that the animals the county threw away were exactly the ones that would earn their keep on the ground. The county had thrown away with them. There was a rightness to it that pleased her, a symmetry. The whole affair had discarded creatures brought to discarded land to make it whole. Nobody wants the runt or the ruined field, she thought. That's the whole of my trade. I take what they've quit on, and I put the two together, and I wait. She knew, too, that the trade would not stay hers alone, and she found she did not want it to. Gideon Thorne had asked to be told how it was done come winter, and she meant to tell him plainly and completely, because a thing kept secret dies with the one who keeps it, and she had watched too much good knowledge go into the ground with men who hoarded it. She could see the shape of the winters ahead, the feed store man sending farmers her way, the way a doctor sends a patient to someone who has cured the same ailment. The young husband on the far side of the county, nursing his own worst half-acre back, with his own 4 cast-off hogs, the method spreading from fence to fence, across a county that had laughed at its inventor for the better part of a year. There was no patent on it, and no price, and that was as it should be. It had not come to her as an invention anyway. It had come as a remembering a thing the ground itself had been trying to tell anyone who would kneel down and listen, and she had only been the one still there when it decided to talk. She would pass it on the same way she had received it for nothing to whoever asked in earnest, and she thought her father would have understood that better than any other choice she had made all year. He had never sold a thing he knew about soil. He had given it away at fence lines his whole life and died poor and left her the one inheritance that had turned out to matter more than any coin, which was the patience to wait on ground that everyone else had given up for dead. And there would be losses in the years to come, she had no illusion otherwise. Not every ruined field would answer the way hers had. Some ground was truly finished, salted, or scoured, or worked past any return, and she would learn to tell the difference, the way Thorne had learned to read a cough by pattern and by failure. And she would be wrong sometimes and lose animals in seasons and coin finding out. She did not fear that. A trade with no failures in it was a trade nobody had tested, and she had tested this one against the hardest ground and the hardest men the county could put in her way, and it had held. It would go on holding, or it would teach her something when it did not. And either way, she would still be standing at the fence at first light, reading what the night had left her, because that was the one thing she knew past all doubt how to do. The animals were as her pen when she reached the farm, leaner now than they had been at the height of summer, longer in the leg. Barely piglets anymore in any honest use of the word. They came to the rail when they heard the wagon, the way they had learned to come, and she stood at the fence a while looking at them in the failing light, and the gratitude she felt for them was of a kind that needed no words and would have embarrassed her to speak aloud. Whatever she made of the years ahead on this ground or the next, it would be built on the blunt, uncomprehending labor of 34 creatures no other soul in the county had wanted, and she meant to see they never went hungry again for as long as any of them drew breath. There was a plow to hire now, she thought, as she came up the lane, a thing she could finally afford with a clean name and a heavy tin, and she would put it to the spent vines in the days ahead before the ground froze hard. The work would go easy this time. In soil that a year before would have turned back any share she owned, the dark earth parting for the blade, like water folding the brown vines down into itself, where they would rot through the winter and feed the next crop, the way the two failed seasons had, in the end, fed this one. She thought of the man who had called those vines rot on a carcass in the spring, and of how wrong he had been, of how the very tangle everyone had read as the field's death certificate had been part of what saved it, holding the ground together, waiting to give back. Nothing on a farm is ever only dead, she thought, watching the vines fold under in her mind's eye. It's all just waiting to be the next thing. Her father had known that. He had turned vines under this same field in seasons she was too young to remember teaching her the truth of it, with his hands before she had the years to understand the words, and she felt him near her in the thought now. In the smell of the coming turned earth, and the remembered creak of the traces nearer than he had been at any point since the second bad winter took him. She refilled their water and forked them a good measure of feed, better than she had ever been able to spare them, and she did not stint it now because there was no longer any reason to. Then she turned toward the field. It lay empty in the way a field lies empty after a good harvest, which is not the emptiness of a dead thing, but the emptiness of a thing that has given everything asked of it and earned its rest. The spent vines had gone brown and brittle across the dark ground, and she would turn them under before the freeze, so they might feed the soil the way the last 2 years' failures had finally fed it, giving back what they had drawn. What lay beneath them now was not the pale and locked clay she had knelt on in the spring. It was ground that had been broken and turned and warmed and fed by 34 small rooting bodies from the first thaw clear through to the killing frost ground that had forgotten how to breathe and been reminded, and she had not planted a seed of it. She had only trusted what was already there waiting. She walked the length of the 2 acres slowly in the last of the dusk, her boots leaving prints that held their shape in the yielding earth, where a season ago they would have found nothing but a surface hard as a shut fist. At the far end where the field met the beginning of the parcel that was now her own, she stopped and crouched the way she had always crouched, low and close to the ground, the way her father had taught her by doing it himself 1,000 times, without ever once saying why. She pressed her fingers into the soil and lifted a handful and held it, and it was warm. Even at dusk, even with the frost waiting in the night ahead, it held the day's heat deep in its weight, loose and dark and generous, and it smelled of every living thing at once, of root and rain, and the long, slow work of ruin turning back into plenty. She did not stand right away. She stayed there in the last amber light with her hand full of earth and her face unhurried and steady, looking out past the fence line to the 5 acres that were hers to bring back next ground, that another broken family had lost to the same hard seasons that had nearly taken her. And she felt no fear at the size of it, only the settled certainty of a woman who has learned the one thing the whole county spent a year failing to teach her. Land doesn't die, her father had told her dying. It only waits for someone patient enough to ask it the right way. She had been that someone. She would be that someone again on the new ground, in the ground after that for as many failed fields as the county cared to write off in her hearing, because she knew now, past any laughter, what a last dollar and a little trust and 34 unwanted lives could do to soil that everyone else had already buried. Somewhere down the county road, a light came on in a window, and she thought of all the men behind all those windows who had spent a year certain they were watching her fail, and she found she carried no grudge against a single one of them, because a grudge was a thing you fed, and she had better uses for her strength. They had taught her the one lesson the whole hard year came down to, though not a one of them had meant to. They had shown her that the world would laugh at a thing right up until the moment it worked, and would want it the moment after, and that neither the laughing nor the wanting had any power over a woman who kept her eyes on the ground and her faith in what was buried there. She rose at last, her knees stiff with the cold, the handful of earth crumbling warm through her fingers back to the field it came from, and she stood in the last of the light, looking from the 2 acres she had saved to the 5 she had bought to bring back next, and the whole of it lay before her like a sentence she already knew how to finish. She closed her hand around the warm earth and she held it, and she was quietly sure of everything still to come.